Welcome to the philosoVerse podcast, where we deconstruct philosophical paradigms and their contemporary implications. Today, we're conducting an advanced analysis of Simone de Beauvoir's The Ethics of Ambiguity, examining its dialectical relationship with modern critical theory and its implications for understanding freedom in an age of intersecting global crises. We'll be exploring how Beauvoir's phenomenological approach to situated freedom can inform our understanding of collective responsibility in the face of algorithmic governance, climate catastrophe, and systemic oppression.
Indeed. What's particularly fascinating is how Beauvoir's phenomenological, existentialist framework provides tools for understanding the complex interplay between individual agency and structural determination that goes beyond both liberal individualism and structural determinism. Her concept of situated freedom becomes especially relevant when we consider how digital technologies and global capitalism have transformed the very nature of human agency.
Let's begin by interrogating Beauvoir's ontological assumptions about freedom. Unlike traditional existentialist accounts that emphasize radical freedom or deterministic accounts that emphasize structural constraints, Beauvoir offers what we might call a dialectical phenomenology of freedom. Could you elaborate on how this differs from both Sartrean existentialism and contemporary post-structuralist approaches?
That's a crucial distinction. Beauvoir's account of freedom is fundamentally intersubjective and embodied in a way that transcends the traditional subject-object dichotomy. While Sartre's account of freedom often verges on a kind of radical voluntarism, and post-structuralist approaches sometimes risk reducing agency to an epiphenomenon of power relations, Beauvoir develops what we might call a situated dialectics of freedom.
Could you unpack that concept? How does this situated dialectics help us understand contemporary forms of oppression and resistance?
Consider how Beauvoir's framework allows us to understand the complexity of digital surveillance capitalism. When we examine platforms like social media through her lens, we see that our freedom isn't simply constrained by these technologies. Rather, these technologies constitute new forms of situated freedom that simultaneously enable and restrict different modes of agency. The key is understanding how our freedom is always already mediated through technological, social, and economic structures.
This brings us to the heart of our discussion, the dialectical relationship between personal freedom and collective responsibility. How does Beauvoir's understanding of this relationship help us navigate what Achilman Beam calls the universal right to breathe in the context of interconnected environmental and social justice struggles?
That's a profound connection. Beauvoir's ethics provides a framework for understanding how individual freedom is inextricably linked to collective liberation in ways that anticipate contemporary intersectional approaches. Consider how she argues that authentic freedom requires actively willing the freedom of others. This isn't just a moral imperative, it's an ontological condition of freedom itself.
Let's examine this through the lens of contemporary environmental justice movements. How does Beauvoir's understanding of situated freedom help us conceptualize the relationship between individual agency and collective action in the face of climate crisis?
Beauvoir's framework is particularly illuminating here because it helps us understand how individual choices are always already embedded in collective structures of meaning and power. Take the concept of a carbon footprint. While individual actions matter, Beauvoir would argue that authentic freedom requires understanding how these actions are situated within broader systems of production and consumption. This leads to a more sophisticated understanding of environmental responsibility that transcends both individual moralism and structural fatalism.
This reminds me of Andre's mom's critique individual-focused climate solutions. How might Beauvoir's ethics help us navigate the tension between individual responsibility and the need for systemic change?
Beauvoir's concept of ambiguity is crucial here. She would likely argue that we need to hold both individual and systemic dimensions in tension, recognizing that our individual choices matter precisely because they're implicated in broader systems of power. This helps us avoid both the trap of purely individualistic solutions and the paralysis that can come from focusing solely on systemic change.
Let's delve deeper into how Beauvoir's ethics intersects with contemporary critical theory. How might her understanding of situated freedom contribute to discussions of algorithmic governance and digital sovereignty?
Beauvoir's phenomenological approach becomes particularly relevant when we consider how algorithmic systems mediate our experience of freedom. Her emphasis on the embodied, situated nature of freedom helps us understand how algorithmic governance doesn't simply restrict freedom from the outside, but shapes the very conditions through which freedom is experienced and exercised.
Could you elaborate on how this relates to recent critiques of algorithmic colonialism and digital capitalism?
Consider how Beauvoir's concept of situated freedom helps us understand the way algorithmic systems create what Sophia Noble calls algorithmic oppression. These systems don't simply restrict freedom. They structure the possibilities for action in ways that often reinforce existing power relations. However, Beauvoir's emphasis on ambiguity also helps us recognize how these same technologies can be sites of resistance and collective action.
This brings us to an important critique of Beauvoir's work, the question of whether her emphasis on individual authenticity can adequately address systemic forms of oppression. How might we update her framework to better account for contemporary understandings of structural inequality?
That's a crucial question. I think Beauvoir's framework is more sophisticated than some critics suggest. Her understanding of situated freedom already contains within it an analysis of structural power that anticipates many contemporary insights. However, we can enhance her framework by putting it in dialogue with intersectional approaches that help us better understand how different forms of oppression interact and reinforce each other.
Let's explore this intersection with contemporary feminist philosophy. How might Beauvoir's ethics contribute to discussions of reproductive justice and bodily autonomy in an age of increasing surveillance and restriction?
Beauvoir's emphasis on the embodied nature of freedom becomes particularly relevant here. She helps us understand how restrictions on bodily autonomy aren't just external constraints, but fundamentally shape the conditions of possibility for freedom itself. This connects powerfully with contemporary analyses of how different forms of bodily control intersect with broader systems of power.
Could you elaborate on how this relates to contemporary debates about technological surveillance of reproductive health care and digital privacy?
Beauvoir's framework helps us understand how digital surveillance creates new forms of embodied unfreedom that disproportionately affect marginalized populations. Her emphasis on the intersubjective nature of freedom helps us see how privacy isn't just an individual right, but a collective condition necessary for authentic freedom.
Let's turn to the question of collective action and social movements. How might Beauvoir's understanding of freedom and responsibility inform contemporary strategies for social change?
One of the most valuable aspects of Beauvoir's framework is how it helps us understand the relationship between individual transformation and collective liberation. She shows us how authentic freedom requires not just individual choice, but active engagement in collective struggles for liberation. This becomes particularly relevant when we consider the role of privilege and complicity in maintaining systems of oppression.
Speaking of privilege, how might Beauvoir's ethics help us understand what Gayatri Spivak calls unlearning one's privilege as loss?
That's a fascinating connection. Beauvoir's emphasis on the intersubjective nature of freedom helps us understand how privilege actually limits authentic freedom by maintaining systems of oppression that ultimately diminish everyone's potential for genuine human flourishing. This connects with contemporary discussions of how whiteness, for example, functions as what George Yancey calls structured ignorance.
As we approach the conclusion of our discussion, let's consider the practical implications of Beauvoir's ethics for contemporary activism and organizing. How might her framework inform strategies for building collective power while respecting individual agency?
Beauvoir's emphasis on ambiguity becomes particularly valuable here. She helps us understand how effective organizing must navigate the tension between individual autonomy and collective necessity. This suggests an approach to movement building that emphasizes both personal transformation and structural change, recognizing them as dialectically related rather than opposed.
These insights seem particularly relevant to current debates about the role of social media in social movements. How might Beauvoir's ethics help us navigate the tension between digital organizing and authentic solidarity?
Beauvoir would likely emphasize how digital tools can either enhance or diminish authentic freedom depending on how they're used. The key is understanding how these technologies mediate our relationships with others, and whether they contribute to genuine solidarity or merely performative activism.
As we conclude today's episode, what final thoughts do you have about the continuing relevance of Beauvoir's ethics for contemporary struggles?
Beauvoir's framework remains invaluable because it helps us understand freedom as both situated and collective, while maintaining a commitment to individual agency. In an age of intersecting crises, her emphasis on ambiguity and responsibility provides crucial tools for navigating the complex relationship between personal transformation and systemic change.
Thank you for this rich discussion. To our listeners, we encourage you to engage with these ideas in your own theoretical work and practical organizing. Join us next time on the philosoVerse podcast as we continue exploring the intersection of philosophical thought and contemporary struggle. The ethics of ambiguity reminds us that freedom is not an abstract ideal, but a concrete practice that must be continually renewed through our engagement with others and our commitment to collective liberation. Until next time, keep questioning, keep theorizing, and most importantly, keep organizing.